There it goes.
We're live.
We are live yet again.
Yet again, we missed a week.
The most exciting moment of the day.
It is. Of the Friday.
Yeah, for everybody that tunes in. It's exciting.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you're having a pretty boring day.
Yeah.
Why did we miss last week?
Why did we miss last week? I was involved in a search. I'm with Search and Rescue.
Right.
And so we were, it was a tragedy here in the island, and we were up there helping to search. So
so if you're watching this, or if you watch this and have a mind to pray, there's a couple families out this way that could use some prayer.
Absolutely. Ethan and Alex's families.
Yeah. So you were out there helping with the search and rescue.
Yeah.
For a couple
stuff, days. Yeah.
Welcome to Friday Live with Josh and Colin, where we try and find some interesting topic that we, not necessarily that we disagree on, but that we recognize that there's differences of opinion between Evangelical church and the Anglican church or the liturgical church, right? Being a little bit more than that. So if you just take a second to share the video to your Facebook wall, we would appreciate that and love that. That would be awesome. And today we are talking about communion.
And don't forget to comment.
Yeah. Comment. Let us know where you're tuning in from. If you have questions about communion, please comment your questions. And even if you're watching this recorded afterwards, we love engaging with people that comment on the videos.
Absolutely.
So let us know if you're tuning in. Let us know where you're tuning in from. If you have any questions about communion, and maybe share an experience. Maybe sometime when you've partaken in the elements of communion, how have you been impacted by the life of Jesus? We love hearing stories and just seeing what's happened with people. So take a second to share the feed, and we're going to talk about communion. And I love that you can tell right off the bat the difference between someone who grew up in, say, a non-denominational or an evangelical framework and someone who grew up in a liturgical framework,
right?
By just if they say communion or Holy Communion.
All right. I've been wanting to add holy to this.
I know. I can kind of like feel it, right?
There's an anxiety.
And I don't think I put on the actual video description Holy Communion.
No, I don't think you did.
You may be chastised.
Nor
later.
Eucharist.
Yeah. Or I didn't put Eucharist in there. Yeah, that's right. That's right. We tend, in the evangelical church, we tend to not use that type of language.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And right or wrong, but that's it just is what it is. That's what we tend to do. And so we know that this actually can be quite the hotly debated topic. Right? It can be a very divided topic and divisive topic.
Even among traditions where it's more normative, like Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, and that sort of thing. Not even just between
just how are we to think of, it's funny, I think that as much as we get caught up in thinking rightly, let's say it this way, it's like when Paul chastises the people in, is it 2 Corinthians, when he talks about how they're taking communion wrongly. He doesn't chastise how they think about the elements.
Right.
He chastises the practices as they're taking them. So, and maybe this is something we can talk about also, is does the way that you think about it when you take it impact the effect it would have upon you? And I know that's something people would argue about. Some people would say yes. Yeah. But my life can be transformed by Jesus before I know anything about him.
Sure.
But it doesn't necessarily mean I have to think rightly about him,
right,
in order to be changed by him or impacted by him.
Yeah.
Now, I would of course say that discovering the right way to think, in terms of Trinitarian theology, soteriology, and salvation, repentance, all that kind of stuff, if you don't think rightly, eventually you'll get into problems with that.
Sure.
And that's why the early church was so consistently, let's deal with the heresies. Because of where they would eventually lead.
Have these councils, have these creeds.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I'm not saying that, well, let's just keep it all, we don't really care what we think. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that I can, in an evangelical framework, take communion and still be impacted by it, even if
Right.
Even if I view it in a way that's not consistent with maybe church history or anything, broadly speaking, evangelical church. So just saying that. So if you're a viewer out there and we're having this conversation, you're going, and at some point you're going, either Colin is right or I'm right. We've come to fisticuffs.
Yeah.
It's what we're more concerned about is that you actually do it, right? To be a part of a fellowship, taking communion. It is really one of, when you look at church history, one of the fundamental aspects of the Christian faith.
And we, indeed, we, Thursday and Holy Week, Monday, Thursday, right before Good Friday. I mean, that is the day that we commemorate. It's a big celebration, in liturgical churches, because it is the institution of the Eucharist. I mean, that's the night this isn't the, communion is not something that we're the church sort of says, well, it's a tradition. It's like, no, it's instituted by Jesus. He sat down with the disciples the night before his death, gave thanks, broke bread,
it's a big thing.
Yeah, it's a big thing.
Yeah. So okay. For our evangelical listeners, you said on Holy Week. What's Holy Week?
Holy Week is that week that is in between. Well, I'll say the week that's in between Palm Sunday and Easter, but the week that precedes Easter.
Yes.
And it's called Holy Week just because of course, the concentration of holy days, and really that sort of culmination of the story of Jesus's life and ministry and the Passion. And so it's really like in the Anglican Church and in the Orthodox Church and Catholic Church, it's a really like dramatic week. Like we tend to have churches will often have, if you have a service every day, dramatic readings of the Passion narrative, where different people will play the roles, just to emphasize, that this is well, what do they call it? The greatest story ever told, or something like that. You know what I mean? But it is the greatest story ever told. But that it is, just the importance of what we hear in that way to emphasize it. So we have Palm Sunday, and then Holy Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter morning.
Culminating and so the liturgical calendar. Yeah. And it's the Holy Week is really the culmination of the Lenten season.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. The deprivation, or the season of lack, fasting and such. And it's the height of anticipation for the great meal.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which is Holy Communion. Which is I am in the presence of a priest. So I probably, if I don't say Holy Communion, I may get stricken with something.
Well, I won't.
Disfavor.
We'll see. He won't buy you a beer after.
So Colin, what is just give us some. What does an Anglican think about when it comes to communion? I know what an evangelical thinks about, typically speaking, right? Yeah. There's obviously variations within evangelical circles, but what does an Anglican think? Or liturgical perspective? What's the liturgical perspective?
For us, Anglican and beyond, I think.
You're obviously speaking broadly, so you're not speaking. Sure. Trying to sum up things broadly.
As I said in other times before, Anglicans are not. We don't lay down sort of dogma and doctrine the way that the Catholic Church would.
Sure.
And so we don't sort of necessarily codify something and say, this is strictly what communion is. This is how it works, and this is how it happens. I think probably the best way to sum up the Anglican position on communion is to say that what it is a mystery.
Sure.
Where we don't try to say, okay, the bread and the wine, substantially become the body and blood of Christ through this moment in the altar with the priest. Right. We say during a service of communion, when we go to receive, through our service, through the service, the words, through God's coming down to, the Spirit indwelling in us, this bread and this wine mystically become the body and blood of Christ. How does that happen? That's a mystery that God knows.
And obviously other traditions would try and explain that.
Absolutely. And so you have, the Roman Catholics have the doctrine of transubstantiation. Right. Lutherans to a degree and other groups have consubstantiation. Sure. And this gets into like really
technical terms,
minute differences.
That people argue over vehemently.
People have probably died over it at some point.
Yeah. That would be definitely be true in the Middle Ages leading into the Renaissance.
Sure. Yeah.
And how much division there was. It's crazy when you study the history of the Reformation, how many wars happened because people thought differently.
Yes, about things that are very important, but also very minute.
Yes, right. Things that you would think, can we just get together and have a frank conversation, and even if we disagree? But no, they would go, okay, you're dead.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So I think for Anglicans fundamentally, communion is this mystical act that we gather. It is in many ways the sort of center of our worshiping life together as a church community,
right?
And we gather to receive Christ through it,
right?
And so it does have these sort of elements of like mystical union, like
right.
we're taking Christ into ourselves
right.
spiritually,
right?
We are sharing. There is a communal element, so this is like the Last Supper. This is a communal meal with fellow disciples
right.
of Christ,
right?
And indeed it does remind us of and put us in memory of Christ's sacrifice on the cross,
right?
And so when you boil it down like that, I always think that we're not really, like, the traditions that have communion aren't really all that different.
Right.
We differ in the kind of minutiae of how it works and how we explain it,
right.
and what our dogma is about, or doctrine, but fundamentally we're all kind of, I think, saying the same thing, that what communion is this sort of unique thing where Jesus gave himself. He says, do this in remembrance of me. This is this thing that happened at the Last Supper, this thing that happened on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
We would say that it is meant to carry on every time we gather and break that bread together in that particular way.
Right.
Which I understand is similar but different from evangelical.
Yeah, definitely similar. Yeah, it's interesting. Like most evangelicals wouldn't even have a thought about what it becomes.
Right.
It just wouldn't even enter into the frame of mind. And typically speaking, there's definitely churches and denominations that practice this differently. Typically speaking, a communion tends to be an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I say that, it's just kind of, it's not necessarily an afterthought, but it's not a central practice in the sense of most of the Sunday morning gathering, we'll say, where communion would be practiced on a periodic schedule. If you have communion isn't necessarily the central point. Like I know in the liturgy, when you are doing communion leads into it. That's the whole point, is culminating in communion. Depending on the church and denomination and all of that, communion may just be, this is our week to do communion, and so we're going to do it. But now the whole worship structure is pointing to the culmination of this.
Yes.
That's not usually the case. That's not usually how it's thought about. We know we're supposed because Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Because part of the evangelical church has in part divorced itself from the history of Christianity. Maybe I'll get some evil comments for having said that. Yeah. but we have. When my background is charismatic, / Pentecostal, although there's differences between those two things as well. The critique of the Pentecostal church is that to them, Christian history began in 1904 or 1906 or so at Azusa Street, the revival in Southern California. And to the Reformation church, evangelical, or the Protestant church, we'll say. I guess Anglicans are kind of Protestants a little bit, but maybe not reformers.
Yeah.
And the church history then begins in 1500 or so. And so if we look back further, of course, we see that's the funny studying the early church authors. One Anglican priest said to me one time, when I said, I studied the Desert Fathers and all of that, and I'm an evangelical, and he says, "Oh, you're not that far from, eventually you're going to be one of us." was really his. That was kind of his. I know a lot of people that have done that; they become like one of us. Anyway, but when you study the early church fathers, you go, "Well, it's interesting. They seem to think differently, about communion than your typical evangelical church pastor." And I think the big divide, and we just see Claire Cormier commenting, "Claire, awesome to see you on here. Wonderful blessings right back at you." I think the divide has to do, and I think you said it as we were talking about it, sign or symbol, right? And again, those are ways that we think about it, which I think, does it impact me the same regardless of how I think about it. And that, it's an interesting question because you can say yes and no at the same time. Let's take just as an easy example, an atheist that reads the Bible versus a Christian that reads the Bible.
Sure.
The Bible is going to have a much different impact based on the manner in which it's approached and read. And so, the way you think about something definitely can amplify or diminish the impact that it has upon you.
Do you think, because I don't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I just
please.
did. So I guess
you can interrupt me. Hey, by the way, if we were to do a tally of the amount of times you've interrupted me versus me interrupting you, so
I don't keep track.
You've got a long ways to go to catch up with me.
But it's, obviously it's the case that I think from what we said before too, it's like, how we think about something like the Eucharist doesn't necessarily, I guess, like, just to wrap my own head around it, it doesn't change the way that God is using it, but the way we think about it changes the way we receive it.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying that.
Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Like the atheist reading the Bible, I don't think that God is not able to do to them what God does to a Christian when a Christian reads the Bible.
Yes.
But the atheist or whoever does something to themselves and their ability to receive that. When I always think about the image I always think about is like, it's like the blinds in your room. It's like the sun is always kind of coming through, and we can kind of choose either to open them or to keep them shut.
Yeah, the sun's always there. It doesn't change the fact that you'll experience the sun's warmth if you open yourself to it. Yeah. That's an excellent analogy, I think, and so how you think about it does have an impact on how it receives and touches you.
Right.
For instance, I think it was one of the passages that made me start thinking maybe there's more to this than just a lovely moment of reflecting upon Jesus, which is growing up, going to charismatic churches. That was kind of we're going to do now. Think about Jesus a little bit.
Right.
Make sure you haven't sinned, because if you take it while you're sinning, you could be struck down.
Right.
But outside of that, maybe just think about Jesus. Was the journey to Damascus, the Damascus Road, right? Where Jesus is walking with these two disciples who they don't recognize that it's him. And he says he opens their mind to understand scripture, or beginning, I can't remember how it says it, but basically he preaches to him for a long time. And then it says, and when he broke bread is the moment they went, this is Jesus. And it's so specific, right? And when he broke the bread, they recognized it was Jesus. And I went, oh, there's something to that.
Yeah, right. That's really neat. Yeah, and that's beautiful. I have no rebuttal or anything.
Right,
like that. But no, and I think that is, that's, I think for what I would call a memorialist position on the Eucharist, which is just to say that it is a when people, the Eucharist, communion, when people take communion, such as in the Evangelical Church, where it is a thing that makes us think about Jesus.
Right.
I think there is that element though that's going on, right? Like it is bringing us to a moment of being like, oh, right, Jesus, right, in a real changing way. But I think that's not. This is the tough thing as someone who's been a sort of sacramental Christian all my life. Is like I don't think that that's not good.
Sure.
Or that you guys are somehow receiving. Thank you. Yeah, no problem. Or that you're somehow like you're like, well, he's kind of cutting the grace in half there by taking that and not coming to us.
Sure. Well, would be some people that would think that way, but
right.
Yeah.
But is it? But then it makes me think about, well, then how and why is it different? Like what would I say to someone to say, well, no, you should come here.
Right.
Right. And I don't know if I could do that really.
Who was I? I was talking with someone. I don't think it was you. I was talking with someone recently who, just to demonstrate to, anyway, I remember who I was talking to. Wasn't you. Talking about the importance of communion and how it, again, in our evangelical circles, it becomes just, something people don't necessarily make the central focus. and that the idea of it just being a symbol versus being a sacrament infused with the actual life of Jesus, body and blood, was, if you were to tell in any evangelical church, okay, well, if you think it's just a symbol, throw it on the ground and stomp on it. And most people would be really hesitant to do that.
Sure,
right?
sure,
So
sure.
even just showing that there's some kind of reverence, even if you're just, well, it's just a symbol.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really mean anything. It's just the action of taking it is about remembering, and reflecting. But that moment of, well, okay, well, turn your back on the communion table and walk away from it, and people would go, that feels wrong for some reason. Even if we weren't sacramental or liturgical, that would feel wrong. And so I think there's almost an imperceptible way that we appreciate those signposts that indicate and point to the kingdom. And as we open ourselves up to the depth of their impact, we could be impacted more and more.
And absolutely. And I think too, it's like it points as well to, I think of what Augustine, 90% sure it was Augustine, who defined the sacrament. Who said what a sacrament is an outward visible sign of an inward invisible grace. Right. So baptism, when we baptize someone, the outward sign is water, the proper words. We baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost or Spirit. But the inward grace is what we're receiving truly. Communion, the outward sign is bread and wine and words and the form of everything. But what we're receiving is an inward grace, right? And so I think even for people that I mean, that's such a great question, right? To sort of say, well, if it's just this, then stomp on it or whatever. I mean, at least for those people, thank God, there's a memory of like what it has done within us, right? That internal grace and or that invisible inward grace that you do sense that you can't stomp on that. Even something that symbolizes that is holy. And I think too, in a way, this is another thing that, my wife comes from, not that she's ever really gotten after me about this, but comes from, more of your kind of background. And I always think that, anytime I talk to a sort of non-denominational or, Protestant person about liturgy or about ritual, I mean, I'll often say, okay, well, do you put any book on top of the Bible? Would you put other books on top of it, right?
When it's sitting on a table, you mean?
Yeah, if it's sitting on your table. And I've had Bibles on books on top of the Bible, and people have kind of been like, ooh, you should take that book off, right? And for me, growing up, I mean, that would never have occurred to me. Not because it's like I'm denigrating the word of God, but I think for a lot of people that, there is that sort of thing where I'm like, here's a physical object, but obviously is more than that and imbued with something far more than that we have this kind of ritual act towards a word act.
It reminds me of my growing up, going to these charismatic churches, and my dad would always get on me every time we walked in, and I was wearing a hat, take your hat off.
Oh, right. Sure. Yeah.
There was some reverence for this being the house of God. And it's just funny thinking about it, but I was a kid and I didn't care, but it stands out to me, right? You're in the house of God, take your hat off. And I know, like, we've done a lot of recording, of course, and I've been in St. Mary's, which is just right through this wall. Basically the church is right 40 there.
40 feet that way.
40 feet that way. There's a specificity to the flow and how it's set up, and an order and a format, and just to the layout. And I know, even looking to the extent of, say, the Eastern Orthodox Church, if you were to go to Google Maps and look at the Eastern Orthodox churches from the top down view, almost every one of them is set up like a cross. Because it's the kind of the view of God's looking down and being reminded of how much He loves them, or what right or wrong about that. But there's this real specific way of thinking about it's supposed to reflect something very intentionally, right? And I know the church here has, I don't think it's set up like a cross.
It is.
Is it when you look up
a little bit, not as drastically, but a little bit.
But that's a thing, right? And most evangelicals wouldn't even know that. And the building is more the functional tool of what we do, as opposed to, the building's neither here nor there. It's just the building that we the building that we tend to gather in. Right. Now, I will say with charismatic people, they would have a value for the consistency of gathering in a specific place. And the language that we probably use would be something to the effect that our worship leaves a deposit. And I want to know what you think about this. Our worship leaves a deposit of the presence of God. And so by worshiping, and you know that by worshiping we mean singing.
Oh, right. Okay, good. Thank you, because I'm still.
Yeah, you're still that way. You'll never wrap your head around that one.
That's never going to be normal.
By worshiping and engaging and encountering the presence of God on a continual basis in this place, I'll go full-blown charismatic on you. We steward an atmosphere that leaves a deposit of the presence that will impact other people unbeknownst to them when they walk in.
I'm down with that.
And so the language that when you start to get even a little more esoteric would be our response in worship, stewarding the atmosphere, opens a portal to heaven. So the heavenly presence touches in that place.
See, this is one of these ways where it's like, you know,
it's our language, you know?
No, but this is one of these ways where I'm just like, you have, you know, that on this end.
Yeah.
And I think you have like, you know, real old school orthodoxy on this end.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, I don't think that's really all that different.
Exactly. I don't think so. Right.
No, I think I probably not, like, these two sides don't think that.
Yes.
But I'm like, to me, that is like, and people will go into an old church and people say, well, this place is saturated with prayer.
Yes, exactly.
You know, or like this is,
right.
You can feel that this is holy ground.
Yeah.
That's the same thing.
It's exact same thing.
And I do think we cultivate, absolutely. No argument here. You were trying to see.
No, I wasn't looking for the argument. I was just looking for the odd look on your face for the language.
I mean, the language was totally weird.
Yes.
But I mean,
well, that's what happens. But people get lost because of the language, right? Yeah. We do get lost because of the language. And so we've even talked a little bit that we've talked about when using the term like encounter, like you guys wouldn't use that. I mean, we've talked about that before. Yeah. You wouldn't necessarily use that, but we're talking about inherently the same thing.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, coming back to communion, I tend to think personally that there's more to it than just the symbol as I'm receiving it, because Jesus did say, "This is my body." He didn't say this is a symbol of. He said, "This is this. This is this." Yeah. And so, whatever that crossing point is, and I like how you frame that. We don't pretend to understand the mystery of Christ's life being in there, but when I take communion, I try and emphasize the fact that this isn't just a time to reflect. This is a time to experience union with Christ. This is, however you want to say it, a declaration, a sign, a place of union with his life. Yeah. And thinking through the whole metastasizing the elements that you've received, that they actually become part of you.
Yeah. Right.
Like that's a big thing.
Yeah.
And so I go, okay, so I'm curious what your thoughts are, because I mean, every church that I've ever attended and called myself a part of, we never use wine. We use grape juice. And I've heard some people try and say, well, technically, if you look at some of the historical context, they probably used grape juice too. He probably didn't see it, but Colin just rolled his eye. He just rolled his eyes. Okay. Yeah. You might not have seen that on the camera, but he definitely
drunk on grape juice.
No. Anyway, like
grape juice to make glad the heart of man. I don't know.
Yes, grape juice. Yes. I've only heard it once or twice. People trying to make a case for that. Obviously, I don't think that's the case.
Yeah.
Or the use of the wafer, and I know some thoughts about the wafer unleavened. It's supposed to be unleavened. There's some specific things to it. Typically, most of your pastors are going to get a thing of Welch's grape juice and go to the grocery store and buy a thing of bread. Right. There's not necessarily a whole lot of thought behind where they come from. So, and I was going to a church a while back that they had a communion service that was much more informed by the liturgical practices. And when we served port, wine at that point, and that was because the high alcohol content helps to cleanse it. And
yeah, same with us.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And our pastor said, "Oh yeah, I just get it at you can get it for dirt cheap because it's like heavily discounted,
really bad port."
Well, it was heavily discounted at the local supplier for religious things.
Oh yeah,
something like that. And so I was like, "Oh, where do you get this?" Because a big old thing of it, right? Yeah. And that's what he said. I was like, "They're just total world that I wasn't even connected to, right?" Because I'm thinking Welch's grape juice and your local store bought bread.
Yeah.
And so, how central is where it comes from and how it's made? And even in that church, at one point, we had a guy baking unleavened bread every Sunday morning. And it's kind of cool to do that. But
yeah, I mean, I think that I tend to think that the way we would talk about sacraments is we'd say that, for a sacrament to be valid, as I said before, you need to have the proper matter and the proper form. So, you can't baptize.
I can't take a taco chip and coffee and call it communion.
No, right. And you can't baptize someone.
I have done that actually and called it communion.
Have you?
Yeah. Once.
Okay. That was a long time ago, I heard.
We won't talk about that.
Let's not. With baptism.
Just for me, not for everybody around. Good. It was just me.
Okay, good.
It was a special grace afforded to me in the moment.
And the Spirit, you had an encounter, and that was, so we have the proper matter form. So you can't baptize someone in milk and just say, "I baptize you in the name of God," right? We understand that water is the specific,
it's a waste of milk.
It's a waste of milk.
Yeah.
Why would you waste that milk?
That's right.
Water is the specific element, and the proper form is the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Communion, bread and wine. I would come down fairly sternly and say that I think wheat and wine are important.
Yeah. So if I just replaced your port bottle with Welch's grape juice, you'd have a crisis of conscience.
I don't know. Like if I went somewhere and they said, "This is all we have."
I've always heard the reasoning behind it. And I haven't studied when it shifted in the evangelical church. Was for people that struggled with alcoholism.
Sure, and that's a valid thing. And our teaching, I mean, the Anglican teaching and the teaching of sacramental churches is that to receive in one kind is to receive in full.
Okay.
So if you only take the bread, you're not getting half the grace kind of thing. Right. So I would come to, but then in terms of, leavened, unleavened, I've been in churches that do, I know people who would say, no, it has to be unleavened.
Right.
I've been in churches that use leavened bread and it was always made by the same lady at 5 a.m. every Sunday.
Sure.
And I'm like, that's beautiful. That's lovely. That's a gift to this community. We do believe that when we're going to church, when we take part in this, we are offering ourselves and our belongings and our goods as a sacrifice. We put money in the plate. Making bread is a beautiful sacrifice. So, there's normative practice, and I don't think that leavened versus unleavened is, going to invalidate everything.
But coffee versus and I think one of the main issues when it comes to Scripture and that particular thing is that wine or grape juice, however you want, because it's crushed, the pressing and the crushing of the particular thing is called I can't remember how it says it. It's in the Old Testament a couple different times. It's called the blood of wine is the blood of grapes, I think is what it says in the Old Testament. Very specifically. Yeah. It's called blood in the Old Testament.
Interesting.
And so, you can kind of go, okay, with the grape, you could get there, grape juice, you kind of get there because you're not going through the fermentation process, but you're going through the crushing process to create the juice for it, right? But that fermentation process and thinking of the analogy behind it and the symbology behind it, whatever, the bread literally gets put in an oven and fired. Yeah. And in that sense, it symbolically represents that Christ has taken the fire for you. Right. You no longer are subject to that fire, the fiery day of wrath, right? Christ has taken that for you. So there's all kinds of deeper and deeper mystery as you go with it. But I think looking at that wine is the blood of grapes, going, okay, I can make an excuse for grape juice then. But I think you're probably right. There's something specific to, especially looking at the statements about that being so specific and representing his wine. And then anyway,
and I think too, for us, there is this element of like, faithfulness to the tradition too. That
sure.
It's not that if you necessarily don't follow it, sometimes that your salvation is at risk, but it's like we are kind of beholden to the church's tradition, and that is the teaching and what we've done. So there's hills in that I die on, and there's ones that I wouldn't.
Good.
But should it be normative to do it with flaming hot Cheetos and Diet Coke? Probably not.
No, but there might be a special grace for that.
Well, and that's a good question.
We should go get some flaming hot Cheetos and Diet Coke.
Some. I think they have a habanero one, but that's a good question. Someone brought that up. I remember in seminary, someone said, well, they had read somewhere about they were Christians in a persecuted country or they're imprisoned, and it was like all they had was like water and I don't know what it was, something. Sure. And there was a priest in prison with them, and they celebrated the Eucharist. And so the question was, even though we didn't have the right matter, is that is it still effectual? And that's a great question. And I think that's a different thing to someone doing it at home or whatever.
Well, and you're looking through church history in the early church, there was definitely provisions given. Like I was baptized in the desert where there was we had water bottles. Mm-hmm. And so, it wasn't full immersion. It wasn't a sprinkling or anything like that, but we lowered me and poured water all over me. It was, how are we going to do this? Because we only have water bottles to do this with. And there was special provisions, definitely saying you should probably do it this way.
Yep.
But given the means, you don't go, and this is, I know this happens to people as they, and we'll wrap up in just a second. They say something like, well, I didn't have a pastor, in my, but I didn't have a pastor around to baptize me, so I haven't been baptized. Oh. And, it's, did you have someone willing that could say, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit? Yeah. That on some level wasn't just a horrific, sinful person, that was actually trying to do this Jesus stuff. Even they might not be perfect, but they're trying to. Okay, then good, go do it.
Yeah,
right. There's
and that's an example for us of where we make that provision, where that like the tradition of the church, the normative practice is by a priest in church.
Yes, right.
But if God forbid someone's in a car accident and you have a lay person that has to scoop up water from a puddle and baptize you as you're dying, that is a totally
legitimate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very good. Well, it's been really fun.
It's been a good one.
Yeah,
it's a good
lots of fun. As always, there's ways that we think differently, but it's oftentimes it boils down to how we use our language, and then because we're almost using different language to try and explain the same thing from different angles.
Yeah.
And for any of you that have been watching, I really hope next time you take communion, whether it's in the Anglican framework, whether it's in Catholic or Orthodox or Evangelical, Charismatic, Pentecostal, that you do it with a little more intentionality, that you are uniting yourself with the body and blood of Jesus and coming into union with him and systematizing his life, or metastasizing, maybe that's whatever, digesting. His life. You're becoming one with him. And so
that's a good one.
So thank you guys for joining and sharing this, all that stuff. And we'll see you.
Well, Monday, we have an episode coming out.
We have an episode coming out Monday, and we'll see you Friday.
Yeah.
Next Friday. Yep.
Peace.
Okay. Yes. Peace. That's right.